Welcome, Dr. Nicole LePera, a friend, a colleague, a brilliant person. I love you. I just think you're phenomenal. You have taught me so much. I learned so much from you. Your page is an inspiration. You're an inspiration. Your story is an inspiration. And you've just released a book, which I am probably first in the queue. I got the first PDF copy, I'm hoping, or one of the few. I'm waiting for my hard copy, but congratulations, welcome, and thank you for joining me on the show today.
Well, thank you, Dr. Carolyn Leaf. I'm just so honored and smiling ear to ear when I hear you say that, because you're such an inspiration to me. I see such alignment with our work, and I just love every opportunity we have to collaborate.
I agree with you. And when you and I get going, we don't stop. We could just talk all day, and it's just
Watch
so
out,
beautiful.
world. Here we come.
Watch it. We're not on the clock now. We are on the clock. We're not on the clock. We keep going. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. And I know everyone knows you, but if you don't mind, just give us a brief intro, who you are, and then and why you wrote the book. Mainly focus on why you've written this book. Can you hold up your books? I don't have the copy here. This is phenomenal. Doing the work. I love that, because everyone in this fast technological age, everyone wants 5 steps quick fix. Everyone wants, 3 steps quick fix. What's the quick fix? What's the pill? You and I talk a lot about how you've got to do the work. So what a brilliant title. Tell us about the book, why you wrote it. What was the inspiration?
Yeah, I'll be the first to admit too that quick fix model was very, very alluring for me for a very long time. And I'd come from a family who very much did look for the quick fix, did look for the thing outside of ourselves to make us feel better, regardless of whatever it was that we were feeling uncomfortable with. So I'll be the first to say that, I'm guilty, quote unquote, of trying that approach. And I came by this work actually through my own journey of healing after years of being in the system, both as a client myself, struggling with lifetime anxiety, lifetime OCD symptoms, panic disorder, and then obviously sitting on the other side of the couch as a trained clinical psychologist. Several years into my practice, I started to feel very disempowered. I started to come to realize that I, as a human, was struggling myself to create change. I was essentially cycling through these negative habits and patterns, despite increasing amounts of insight and awareness about myself. And of course, despite all of the book knowledge, right, that I was trained with in school of how to help others to heal, I came to realize that I wasn't actually creating that change in my life. And then furthermore, possibly even more disturbingly, I came to see that same disempowerment in my clients who, again, despite progress or felt progress week after week in session, were not able to, as I say, build that bridge and actually utilize insight into creating action change. So from that really low place, I dove into research. I sought to really understand why isn't the field operating in a helpful way? Why is no one really getting better? And I began to understand several reasons why. I began to shift the way that I was working from a focus on the mind, as we, traditionally in the field were taught. I was a minister of talk therapy. If we do change our thoughts, we change the way we feel and act. To really understand that there are other actions, that there is a more holistic way that we need to address the human experience. We are a mind, we are a body. I believe that we have an essence, that individuality that makes each of us in our uniqueness. And until we begin to honor how all of those parts play a role in either our stuckness or our healing, we're going to remain disempowered. So when I came to understand this holistic model of wellness, my first step was to go online, to find a space where I could begin to share some of these new realities, or these new truths, as I call them. And very quickly, as I began to share my own journey in healing, I was met with how universally resonating some of these concepts, first and foremost, I should say, how universally resonating this stuckness was. I was seeing humans now around the world that were, that were stuck, that were unable to create change, just like the humans in Philadelphia, right, where I was working. So now I'm saying, okay, like this is quite universal of a problem. So many of us are struggling to create change in our life and are feeling disempowered. And then, of course, I found the resonance to be such a motivator for me, understanding the limitations that Instagram and all social media would ultimately offer, which is, you get a square, you get a caption. And I really wanted to unpack this topic of holistic wellness in the most comprehensive way. So I was very gratefully offered the opportunity to write it in a book style form. And I've been on this book writing journey now for almost 2 years. So I am just so ready for the work to live in the world, to get into the hands of those who are on their journey to meet the work.
Oh, well, that's a beautiful story. And this is one of the most important books that people can get their hands on, because if we don't sort out all those issues, we don't function as humans. I mean, we function in this broken way, in a broken world, and we just contribute to brokenness. And our uniqueness, that essence that you talk about, I love that you call it the essence. I call it like the wise mind, or this, I describe it as the strip of beautiful green trees through the middle of our mind. That's just perfect. And if we don't activate that and work with our messy minds with that, we don't give to the world what only we can give. So I'm so grateful that you've written this book, because you do unpack something that's extremely complex, but that's extremely, everyone who's alive, who's a human, is a mental mess to different extents since the beginning of time. It's not something new, and you're giving us a beautiful way of understanding that and really unpacking it and dealing with it. And so I want to thank you for that and encourage people to get this book. It's phenomenal. You are phenomenal. There's so many things that I want to ask you, and I've got some questions, but I know we end up always just discussing everything. But just to start off with, you have some very interesting titles of your chapters in the book, which, I love that. I love to look where they disappeared, and I had it all open here at the chapters. I love that because looking at gives you the big picture, and you start with the dark night of the soul, and then you end off with the pizza box in your epilogue. And I find that fascinating. If you don't mind, I know that's a funny way of starting a question, but for me, that's kind of how I work. You started off somewhere and you ended off with that. So I'd love you to just unpack the beginning and the end, and then we can play around with a bit of the middle. But I love that.
Absolutely. I want to build on what you're acknowledging, and essentially what you're normalizing, which is the messiness of us all. Because in that stuck place, I think a lot of us carry a lot of shame. We begin to indulge those ideas that we are broken, right? That certain life experiences, fulfilling relationships, finding our purpose and our passion and living that into existence. So many of us begin to believe that that's not for us, that's not going to be part of our journey. So I love how your work, very similar to my work, really normalizes that and says, no, there's very real reasons why we're stuck in the ways that we are. And you also embedded something very beautiful in what you were just sharing, which is, again, I think we share the same belief in that we are whole. You come here as full and as perfect and as really purely connected to, I'll use my language, that essence. However, we become stuck, just to wrap this all together, as a result of our past experiences.
Exactly.
So I kind of paint this picture of an onion, right? We have this perfect full being that, based on an accumulation of life experiences and all of the ways that we adapt, because we're incredibly adaptive, and our brains, as you and I just spent talking about, your beautiful new book really shows how life affects our brain. We begin to become conditioned. All of those layers of that onion begin to form, and then we begin to operate what I call outside of alignment or in misalignment. So I started my book with the first intro into my own healing journey, terming it the dark night of the soul, because the simple way that I know maybe listeners have heard of that concept, might be a little unsure, or might think it's a little woo-woo, what the hell is she talking about? The simple way that as I often simplify things, a dark night of the soul for me is an accumulation. It looks quite individual. For some of us, it's the physical symptoms. For others, it's the psychological, the mental, the emotional, the lack of fulfillment in our relationships in life that result, in my opinion, from that misalignment, from not being authentically connected to our needs in any of those areas of being that make us human. Our physical body's needs, our emotional body's needs. And the large majority of us, while we all do have that deeper intuitive essence-ness space, intuition, a lot of us like to call it, we can't find our way there.
I love that.
So it is the dark night of the soul. I enter with that. I wouldn't have described, if you would have spoken to me as I was nearing my 30s, which is when mine began, you wouldn't have heard me saying, oh, this is my dark night right now that I'm going through. I actually had no idea what I was going through. And in the beginning, I actually entertained quite real issues. I thought, oh, I'm going through something physically wrong with me, a medical issue, or I'm going through something, here's my panic coming back again. I'm going to have another 5 years of panic attack. Great, right? So I wouldn't have used this language at the time, though I now understand that is what that is. Our soul, our essence is in there. That intuitive space never goes away. Though those of us, the large majority of us that are disconnected and that are operating in that state of disconnection, do begin to accumulate symptomology. So like you say, the symptoms, the anxiety, the depression, that screams to the surface, and they're messengers.
There's your tree. I'll use the props as you call them up. I'll use the props for you.
Absolutely. And that's what it is. And for so long, a lot of us identified with that. We become, as you beautifully said, the issue. We become the stuckness. We become the depression. And what this work is about for me is to, again, send that relief out there for those of us that are entertaining those beliefs, to acknowledge that we aren't broken, we are whole. And of course, I make a particular intentional effort throughout the book to translate the concepts of each chapter. So once we enter into the process of healing, we get to talk about my foundational steps to create change. So I speak conceptually in each chapter, and then I offer the practical, the how do I build a bridge, the how do I embody now this tool in action to begin to walk the journey of healing back again to that alignment.
That's just everything you say is just so beautiful. When you talk about that essence, and you talk about everything you've just said, is just so manageable in terms of understanding what we're trying to be as humans, that drawing back to that essence, as you call it. And the analogy I use is the forest, that our unconscious mind's got all the forest, all these thoughts that we've built from our experiences. And then what I always explain is the essence that you call the essence, I call that strip down the middle of the forest, which is that perfect part of us, that wired for love. In biology and in brain neuroscience, we talk about the brain and the body being wired for love. And we talk about the optimism bias in psychology. That's the optimism bias, which is this joy. And it's basically survival. It's basically love. It's basically getting back to that inner core wisdom that keeps us alive and keeps us operating and when you said there that we get so stuck in our emotional pain that we can't see the essence, the way that I've been describing that is that there's so many of these trees blocking the access to that inner wisdom that we can't see the wood for the trees. I mean, we just get so stuck in these, but we can get over that. And you teach that so beautifully. Your book is so filled with wisdom, and the practical steps are fantastic. The practical side, the way you've applied it, is so essential, because there are so many psychology books and self-help books out there that are filled with quick fixes, or so much theory that you don't know what to do with it. And it's all great theory, but what does it all mean? And I love how you've taken those concepts, simplified them, and then turned them into realities for people. So then you end off with the pizza box.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that too, because
I love it.
Thank you for acknowledging the longevity of these tools, right? It's not about using them one day, 2 day here and there, white knuckling it. It's about integrating this new way of being. So very intentionally, the book is titled How to Do the Work, which really honors the daily actions that we have to create for ourselves to shift into change. So speaking about optimism and getting, of course, to the pizza box, old me, past self me, if you will, definitely didn't resonate with being optimistic. I actually, for a long time, wore the badge of a realistic pessimist. And I would say, I'm realistic. This is just how life is. Again, I came from a family that very much had not the optimism bias that, we're all born with. So the negative attribution bias, always looking for a threat, as a lot of us do when we're stuck in those cycles of anxiety. So for decades, Carolyn, optimism was nowhere to be found in my life. And I have a very pivotal moment that I was sharing with my partner as I began the healing journey, as I created these changes, as I integrated these new steps into my life. As you share in your research, structural changes began to lay down in my brain, even unbeknownst to me, because I wasn't yet feeling better at this time yet. I was having a very conversation with my partner, Lolly, and I don't even know what we were speaking about. So I guess the way I was sharing whatever I was sharing with her in that moment, she looked at me, her jaw dropped open, and she goes, "Oh my God, Nicole, I think I see hope." And she goes, and I don't know if I've ever seen that in your eyes before. And that for me just was so moving. I didn't yet feel hopeful. Like I said, hope was absence. It was absent.
Didn't have it. Yeah.
Optimism
wasn't part of your psyche. It was just
be there, because my mental mess, right? All of my trees or my structures were wired not toward optimism, though toward negativity. So for me, that was really poignant. And now I would go ahead and say is that a lot of changes structurally have happened in my brain. I've done the work, and I continue to do the work each and every day to continue to create those changes. And now for me, optimism has become, I've returned back to that resting state where I can be in reception and receipt of the moment at hand. So the final chapter, the epilogue, titled The Pizza Box, it's really about a quote. It references back to a quote that I met when I was pretty low. I was in my 20s and my anxiety, my panic was at an all-time high. My mom was suffering from pretty severe heart issues. She had had a pretty major heart surgery, and I had a lot of fear around her death, around losing her at that time. So I was, to say the least, a mental mess, use your language. And I met a quote. I was walking by a museum, and there was a quote on the wall that said something along the lines of life is lived in moments. And I was so touched by that. I was like, that is so interesting. Life is lived in moments. And I loved quotes. So I went back to my office and I did some Googling. And when I was trying to find the author of that quote and just a little more information on who he was, the word moment, I think, pinged on Google this concept of mindfulness. And at that point in my 20s, I discovered this practice of consciousness and the power of the present moment. And intuitively, I was like, ping, 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 something is really important here. Though, to action that, to begin to practice living consciously, like many of us, I didn't. It was uncomfortable. When I began to stop and become consciously aware of who I was and how I was in that moment, all I felt was the anxiety, and it was overwhelming. So it wasn't until years later where I began to actualize that change. I began to look at why I struggled to change based on, I learned something new. Why can't I go do something new? It took many years before I began to understand why I was stuck, and then to begin to apply the principles of change. And when I began to apply the principles to create change, like I was saying, I changed. I began to see incredible shifts, embracing consciousness as my daily way of being. And in doing that, actually allowing in feelings like optimism, I first should start with presence, and then allowing in optimism and joy and all of the other stuff that we can receive when we're fully here.
I love that. You've touched on so many profound, important things. One thing you said that was, it took years. So people need to understand that this is a lifelong journey. I mean, both of us are in this field, and both of us keep admitting that we battle with mental messes. I mean, as you said, doing the work, my book, Cleaning Up Your Mental Mess. I mean, this is a normal thing. But the difference, what you say a lot, and I also say a lot, is that we both own it, but we both know what to do with it. That's where I've changed, Nicole, in terms of my journey. Is if I think back to myself in my early years, 20s and younger, and even my early years of my marriage, and I was in the field already, but I was so clinical that I didn't really apply to on a day-to-day level. It was so clear in therapy on these really severe situations, and only then sort of started clicking, hey, this is something I can use. And that, as you say, that sort of the realizing the work, realizing that we have this autonomy, and realizing it's going to take time is so important. But you speak about consciousness in a way that I love, and that consciousness element in terms of, when we talk about consciousness, people always think in mindfulness, we always think, okay, I've just got to think of now. I mustn't think of the past and the future. But our minds are always going, and they're always traversing the past and the present and the future. They time travel. So your mind never doesn't time travel. So when you talk about consciousness, you're one of the few people that really also explains that consciousness is being aware in the moment of it's more self-regulation. It's actually showing up for yourself. What am I thinking? Where's this coming from? So it's not like you obliterate the past and you obliterate the future. It's that you actually now training yourself to self-regulate and see, what am I doing in this moment? What am I doing in my relationship? How am I functioning? And as you say, you had to be present first before you could do that. So, and until it starts there. If we keep looking for the external antidote, that thing I'm going to put in me or on me or in my mouth, or that the 10 positive affirmations, the whole toxic positivity, I've got this big wound and I'm just going to slap on the affirmations. That's not going to work. The work is being able to embrace that pain, being able to be present with it, being able to recognize there's a past and a future, and that you can change the future and all that kind of stuff. So I wanted to thank you for how you really bring that to the table, because you can't change without that. People always ask me, but how do you start the change? And you start the change with this presence, this consciousness, this awareness, this self-regulation. And you emphasize that so much in your book. So that I just wanted to really hone in on that point, because it's super important.
Thank you. And I very intentionally, Caroline, put that consciousness practice right up at the front. It is the first intro chapter.
Yeah, I see that, which is
the work, because in my opinion, it is foundational. And I share this now because I think very understandably, if you've met my work before, you've heard of inner child work or ego work, I think a lot of times we become attracted to do that work because we know that there's some answers in there that we might identify our inner child as wounded, or my ego is telling all these crazy stories that don't help me. Yet I'm always the person to suggest and acknowledge we can't just go right to dive into that work. No. We don't want to. I don't suggest, we go into chapter whatever that is 8, 9 and read that work first, because it is through the foundation of consciousness that we begin to see how our past is coloring our present. We begin to see, right, all of those old trees, to use your language, for my language, all of the wounding of our inner child and how that continues to color what is happening here and now. And in particular, how we're feeling, and then what we're doing as a result of how we're feeling in the here and now.
Absolutely. Those are so real.
That we get to see that, because another thing that I know that us humans love to do is we like to look for the universal. The 5 steps is going to help all of us the same. And the reality is we're not the same. We're unique individuals. We lived unique circumstances. So as we become conscious, we can become clear of the areas that we need to create new habits in. So for some of us, that might be around the physical body, acknowledging that the way we're connected or not connected to our bodies and how we're caring for it might be contributing to some of those imbalances or that misalignment that I talked about. A larger majority of us are going to notice that emotionally, we're not really connected to our emotions, or if we are, they're running our show and we're not able to self-regulate. Right, to use, I think, both of our language a little bit.
The messy mind versus,
great chapter on emotional maturity and how to develop that, the ability to have a feeling, process it, and then return back to baseline or to a peaceful state. And again, we can see the habits and patterns that aren't serving us when we build that foundation habit of consciousness first.
That's vital. It's so vital what you said. That I love how you explained the emotional stuff as well, that we've actually got to, because our mind is think, feel, choose. So everything, and then that produces the thought, and then that produces what we're saying, what we're doing. So you can't not look at all the aspects. And I love the fact that how you say that the emotions are going to show up, and you've got to acknowledge them. They're not going to go away. You can't shove them away. You can't push them down. You have to give them space, unpack them, and then get them back to baseline again. I mean, that's beautiful the way you explain that. And these are all not quick fixes. And I know you're familiar with the work, and I put it in my book as well, but that population study that was done, the federal data that showed us that when we hit 2014, the trend of people living longer had reversed, and people are dying 8 to 25 years younger. And now we've got the pandemic, which has knocked another year off. So people have this constant message of mental health is on the rise, 1 in 4 with depression, 1 in 5 with anxiety, pandemic and mental health. There's so much fear. And I want to throw this out at you and see how you feel about this. I don't think that mental health is on the rise. I think the mismanagement of mental health has created a whole new problem where we've ignored the story and the narrative and the humanity, and we're just trying to lump it in a box, tie it up in a bow, shove it in the corner and say, well, live with that, take your medication, do your CBT, and I want to come to that in a moment as well, as opposed to allowing people as humans to express themselves and to process what they're going through. Because if you look at those statistics, they're tracking it back to preventable lifestyle diseases. And what drives lifestyle? Mind. And so if mind is creating these lifestyle diseases which are preventable, we have to address how we're thinking, feeling, and choosing about these things. We have to do the work. To quote your book, we have to do the work. And you also talk about, and I'm laying this whole foundation for you to just run, you talk about showing up. How we show up is a product of these and these. And very often these, whatever you think about the most, will grow in your brain and your body and your mind. So if this has had more tension, this is the huge tree that you're going to show up with. And that's how you look at life versus this. And being present is how you can see this. What am I doing? If you're not present and you just slap on a technique, you're never really going to see how you're showing up, because you're kind of using that technique as an avoidance or a distraction or a band-aid. So, I mean, I've said a lot then. I know I've stimulated you, so take it away.
Yeah, no, I was thinking, and I couldn't agree more. I always wondered, Caroline, in the field when I was in my training in particular, why there wasn't much we were learning about prevention, that word in general, and where those programs were. And don't we have hope that if we intervene at a time earlier that we can stave off some of these things? So that was always in the back of my mind as I looked around and continued to see the focus on the treatment or the management
I agree with you.
symptoms in particular. And I more that I think that the more we try to band-aid our symptoms or just approach managing them in a way of stuffing them down, the more we do begin to then accumulate the consequences of that.
I agree with you.
Right, in those much more avoidant ways, through all of the ways that we as humans do that. Again, with the belief that that was the only option for a very long time in the field.
That was my training.
I too believe that my only option was managing my symptoms, right? How can I make my anxiety
managing symptoms, compensating,
comfortable enough range, though it wasn't comfortable, that I could continue to go to work, to have relationships, though they wouldn't feel fulfilling. I didn't feel present, but though I could keep going because I never understood there was actually a conversation around getting better that I could have with myself. And so I agree. I think another aspect of why humans as a collective outside of 2020 and the very unique stressors and fears and insecurities that are coming as a result of this very real collective trauma, I continue to watch us as humans live in very unnatural ways. Societal conditioning. Most of us are living in cities. We're now hooked up to electronics all day long. We have this go, go, go kind of
hurry sickness.
We're pushed and celebrated. We're living on top of each other. Cities are loud. I mean, I could go on and on. So I think a combination of all of those factors are really bringing the symptoms that most of us are experiencing to a critical mass. However, I think the beautiful shift that is happening is through people like myself and like you that are beginning to question that and are beginning to, share our own journeys of healing backed by scientific research that is actually saying, no, conversations about wellness, about prevention are absolutely what we should be talking about. We should be understanding, pulling back, right? Seeing our symptoms as the messengers that they are, whether you're listening and you're carrying all of the physical symptoms that sometimes go along with our earliest woundings and or the psychological ones, if we can understand that they carry a message, not that we're broken,
so good,
but that, right, we've become disconnected typically to our needs in any or all of those areas. So many of us are functioning as adults that are either in complete denial that we have physical, emotional, and spiritual needs, or have no idea how to identify and meet them. And as a result of those conditioned habits and patterns of denying our needs or repressing our needs or avoiding our needs, we're continuing to accumulate all of these problematic ways of being that no longer serve us.
You put that so beautifully, and I resonate so much with what you talked about in your training. Like you were trained to there was no prevention. We literally were trained. We were told the words, it's compensation, because at that stage in the 80s, we were told the brain couldn't change. So it was all about compensation. I remember challenging some of my neuroscience professors, and the neuroscience was in its infancy in the 80s. And I remember them saying, the mind's always changing, our experience is always changing. Obviously, if our mind's changing, our brain is changing, and we have some sort of level of autonomy. And they turned around to me and said that was a ridiculous question. And that really got me going with my research. That's all I needed. Okay, now that's the challenge. You've thrown it. And that's why I went into doing this research. And so the compensation is such a hopeless term. But if you could get into, yes, sure, we have to have some strategies for management, and I'm not anti that. And that's, that's all part of but it's not that where we start. It's where we start is to actually have the conversations, to embrace and to process, and which you teach all the time in your work, and being authentic and having the conversations. And 40 years, I've watched this for 40 years, this trajectory of things changing. And now we sit 40 years later and everyone's going, oh, why are people dying younger from preventable lifestyle diseases? Meanwhile, we live with technology, we hurry sickness, we eating junk food, we, all the advances. We thought that we could just keep doing that and not pay the price. So now, as you say, we're trying to change that. You've got to change how you do your life and your lifestyle. So I'm so grateful that your book is out there, that people can actually see how to do the work. One of the things that I don't even want to say more about that before we transition. Do you want to say any more about?
No, I was just smiling and resonating. And I have a very similar story of my own experience in grad school, just really quickly, where when I met that quote about the moment and I met mindfulness, really fascinated. And I was doing a lot of training, working with individuals in substance use facilities and different aspects of treatment facilities. And I happened to have a professor at my PhD program who studied substance abuse in particular, namely boredom and its role in activating, triggering relapse. So long story short, I had the brilliant idea that I wanted to study how mindfulness could prevent relapse around mindfulness, around boredom in particular, with this idea of I'm present in the moment, my boredom comes down, right? And then I don't pick up the substance that I was using to distract myself.
Very good. Yeah.
Long story short, I presented this whole idea to that particular professor, and the door was shut on my face. I was told that there was no utility in the practice of mindfulness.
Oh gosh.
This was in the 2010s-ish.
I mean, that's
at the time. So mind-blowing to think of that.
Oh
so
gosh.
I shifted my dissertation topic and studied something else. And obviously here I am full circle to say,
Doing that.
there was something important there. And so I feel validated, I guess, when I hear your own struggles, your own pings that you were experiencing in school. Yeah. Because again, I imagine we're not alone. I'm connecting with many professionals around the world who have shifted their own practice, who have felt those same pings that, wait a minute, this isn't the full story. But I just wanted to share that because I do understand what that was now. That was my intuition, picking up on the fact that, wait a minute, we can begin to start to talk about intervening to change. And those of you who are listening, a lot of us are already living in that stuck way.
Yeah.
And now we know the brain can change at any age. So it is through lifestyle changes like we're talking about, integrating new ways of being, embodying ourselves and our needs in a new way on the daily that actually does create change all the way down to our physiology.
Oh, that's brilliant. That's amazing. I wanted to transition to the addiction thing and you brought that up. So I'm so glad you did. But before we do, or which would work for you? I'd love to talk about addiction and just how you see it. And I'd also love to give the listeners a little bit of practical sort of application. And then I also want to talk about things like CBT, because I know that you and I both have the same kind of philosophy around things like that. And because a lot of people want to know, okay, there's psychotherapy, there's CBT, there's so many different modalities. And, you and I come with a more holistic approach and people want to know how to fit that in. So those are the 3 directions I'd love to go in. And I mean, there's a million more, but that's all we're going to have time for. So what works for you to handle that in the most efficient way? So addiction.
I'm going to start with CBT, wrap into how that connects to addiction, and end with some practical.
Love it. Take it away.
The issue that I take with CBT, and I think a lot of us do who have ever heard of affirmation work or mantra work or this idea, just change your thoughts and you'll feel better and behave differently. I think a lot of us can universally acknowledge that it might not have been as successful or as easy as that. Mm-hmm. And of course, in the field, that is the gold standard. That is,
it is.
Tell you, I was videotaped doing CBT. I was assessed on all of the ways that, I was doing it and following the book and protocol. So I know how to do CBT.
Yeah.
Yet again, I continue to watch my clients struggle with creating change. I obviously try to use some CBT techniques on myself, and I continue to watch myself struggle to create change. And again, reason being, we're connected to a body, right? We have that essence. And if we're not tuning into our needs in those areas, we are usually living in a state of imbalance that is sending the same signals of imbalance right up to our brain, to our minds, and keeping us stuck in those cycles of dysregulation. So if we apply that even to substance use, sometimes we have the idea that, can't you see if anyone who knows people, as a lot of us do, who have struggled in any type of addiction, it isn't logical, right? No amount of hitting bottom for some of us can, motivate us to create change. We can't just think a couple thoughts or reframe, next time I think this, I'll think this, and then I won't want to pick it up. That actually doesn't
work, that conditioning. Mm-mm.
And again, because for the same reason, those of us that become addicted or begin to utilize a substance, I see that as a byproduct.
Yeah, totally.
Again, unmet needs, right? Emotional dysregulation. Substance becomes, in my opinion, our attempt at self-regulating. It becomes an immediate or a short-term solution. I can feel better now, with, of course, very long-term consequences for our entire world. So, and I've worked in the addiction field from the very earliest part. I had 2 people come into my very first class in grad school asking if if anyone wanted to volunteer for a clinical opportunity. That's how it was offered. And my hand shot up because it was the first time I could do something clinically, because now I was enrolled in school. So
you could do it.
I was allowed to speak to someone in a clinical way. So outside of the suicide hotline that I worked at when I was an undergrad. So now I wanted to do some actual one-on-one, or it turned out it was group work. So I raised my hand. Long story short, I got connected to this organization, and it happened to be one running groups at an outpatient substance abuse treatment center. And I ran an anger management group for parolees who were mandated to anger management. So here I was, 22 years old, being thrown in this group. And I also ran a women's process group to help women self-regulate their emotions, with the hopes of obviously giving them some tools to begin to break the habit of using substances. So really near and dear to the work of addiction. Up until I stopped practicing in Philly, I was still running groups at an outpatient treatment center because I find, again, addiction isn't about the drug. It's about all of the dysregulation that lives in those individuals, that the drug just becomes their best attempt at coping. So the holistic model of healing couldn't apply more to those that are addicted to substances. Even sharing my story, while I wouldn't have considered myself addicted, the second I met alcohol when I was 13 and marijuana when I was 13, that for me was my peaceful moment. That was what I would ingest then when I would go out and party with my friends. That was my external spaceship, I call it.
Yeah.
I had been dissociating and distracting myself internally, unbeknownst to me. And now I discovered this great thing I could ingest and just check out for a minute. And so I did. So I can even resonate with the lived experience of using something external to feel better emotionally or to attempt to regulate myself emotionally. So when we're talking about addiction, I think this work applies holistic wellness. I do believe wellness is possible. I don't think addiction is connected to chips in the brain.
No.
That's the brain of an addict, if you will, quote unquote, will shift and change, and you will see structural changes, though not as the origin of the addiction, again, as the
result
of it. So the work applies, like I said, to anyone out there struggling with using substances. At this point, Carolyn, I would go as far to say, for some of us, this is going to become the self-harm.
Already.
Become another function of addiction.
Yeah, totally.
For some of us, our thoughts are addicting. If I just spend time in my world, in my internal world, I can be distracted. I can feel some kind of way that's comfortable or familiar. So we can become addicted to anything. And again, the way out is through the work. So the practical tips.
Could I just interject 1 second there, because you've said such profound things and I want to make sure people have got it, that addiction is not a disease in your brain waiting to jump out. It's not some weakness that you've inherited or some neurobiological correlate that you happen to be stuck with. And now if you're exposed to some kind of thing like alcohol or porn or drugs or whatever, oh, well, you are a victim of that and you can't help it and that's your life. And that's the message that we're getting in today's world. For the last 40 years, that has been the message that has built up. And it's this disease that you can't control, you just have to live with it. That is not what Nicole's saying, not what I'm saying. Addiction, if you hear very clearly, is actually a form of distraction to try and cope with the pain of what you're facing, which is just so hard. And as you said, you use the marijuana and the alcohol at the age of 13 to try and get away from this pain of your story and of what it was doing to you, but it wasn't. And there's also the research that shows that 86 to 93% of people with so-called like extreme addiction get out of addiction, not through get out of it completely, through choice. So in other words, it's in a way, and the choice doesn't mean that, oh, I can't choose, there's something wrong with me. It is the choice to become present, to do the work, to embrace, process, and reconceptualize, because until these are gone, these are the things that we're trying to hide with the addiction. So sorry, I just wanted to say that because I wanted to really, and then what you said about CBT as well, you said that so beautifully, that when Nicole and I both talk about detoxing thoughts in our own different ways, getting unstuck. We're not just, CBT is kind of like saying, okay, well, here's this thing and we're going to just condition it to this. You mustn't think this, you must think this. And then there's all these like things to get from there to there. But this is you never get rid of this. So until this is there, this is gone. And it's not like gone, it actually is reconceptualized because you can never obliterate your story. So the attempt to try and numb this or obliterate this is never going to work. You have to actually take this and deconstruct it and reconstruct it so it becomes part of this. So the way I see CBT, and see if this works for you, Nicole, you get X plus Y, okay? There's X plus Y. CBT is trying to say, okay, well, ignore those and just make Z. Yeah. But that's never going to work. What you have to do is say X plus Y equals XY. Here's XY. The light leaves and the dark leaves. I've now reconceptualized and reconstructed. So now I can go forward knowing, what do you think you're doing, Nicole? You with your story, I've got my story. We're going forward and our stories continue to grow because we have acute traumas, we have events and circumstances. That's life. All of us are going to still have trauma of some sort, but we've got to reconceptualize as opposed to just trying to make the white bear effect. I'm not going to think about that anymore. Then you're going to think about it all the time, sort of thing. So I just wanted to say thank you for saying that and just like hammer that point. And I'm sure people get that because it's very freeing and very hopeful. Your book is filled with hope. Doing the work is hope, 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 and hands-on practical hope. Beautiful book.
I'm so glad to hear that it resonates in that way with you. And it is about integrating, our story, our life, and, those of us that are sharing it, then empowering ourselves to share,
Yeah.
even just with one other human in our personal world.
Exactly.
Not necessarily shouting it from the rafters as you and I do. So it is about embracing our story.
Yeah.
But you get asked a lot, do I get to erase my trauma? What is healing? Does it go away entirely? And my answer is always some version of not necessarily. We learn how to integrate it, and we learn, so to shift into the practical, to create. I love that you've already offered this word, Carolyn. So thank you. Choice. We learn how to gift ourselves with choice in each moment. Choice to see the past and how it's trying, right? How those old trees and the toxic thoughts are attempting to be there, are attempting to be the point from which we're reacting, and gifting ourselves, as I say, expanding, creating that space, as you beautifully said, to begin to make new choices, to begin to practice perhaps new thoughts, new ways of embodying our being, new ways of perhaps meeting, acknowledging, and then meeting our needs. And it's through the creation of choice. And how do we get to choice? We practice consciousness. We practice being present to the moment. We practice being aware, like you said, of what's going on in our mind, seeing all of the past as it's firing up at the ready, as it often is, as it still is for me.
Yeah.
Oftentimes, especially around my chorus of wounds, the things that really activate me still are ready to be offered. Those toxic trees are still somewhat there, yet we can expand into that choice again through the practice of consciousness. Understanding, witnessing all of the ways we're not conscious, all of the ways we're living from that autopilot, as I say it, or from those toxic trees, as you say it, and then beginning to expand into that space and to show up presently, to show up in the moment, and to begin to make the new choices that will better serve us. That's how we create the pathway toward a future that's different. How we, as the third byline of my book, How to Do the Work, recognize your patterns, heal from your past because you can, and create yourself, or your future self, as I call it.
So beautiful. That's just it's so hopeful, because it's, when you talk about that, our past is there for us to reconceptualize. That's why I always use the word reconceptualize. And you're talking about, it's just be saying the same thing. I say embrace, process, reconceptualize, getting aware, getting the awareness, gather awareness. Nicole and I are both bringing the same concepts to the table. Both of us have trained up in very traditional method. And I'm much older than you, but still, you still fell in the trajectory timeline where you, even as you said, in 2010, you were challenged by that professor. So it's this is where technology is great. This is where people like yourself, with your experience and your knowledge of going through the system and breaking away from it and seeing it in a more holistic way, how you've got a voice to reach millions of people to be able to help set them free. Because it's so hopeful. It's taking away everything that is you can't control. And you're saying to everyone, you've got agency. And that's one of the things I showed in my research, that the pathway to empowerment starts with agency. And agency starts with awareness, showing up in the consciousness. So thank you for saying that. So you're going to take us to some practical how-tos, or where would you like to go from here?
Of course. And yeah, so agency is so important to cultivate, because again, we become so disempowered, we become so reactive, we begin to, wonder if there is a pathway out. And I know, just again, speaking from my own lived experience as a fellow human being, there is no better teacher than the wisdom of making change, of creating change in your life. I'm a big advocate of creating change through what I call small daily promises, making the commitment or setting the intention to just create one new choice anywhere in our day. I always overemphasize even at times the small aspect of it, acknowledging that we are wired to stay in those familiar patterns. Those toxic thought trees are powerful. And the further we step away from it, entertaining new thoughts, new feelings, new actions, we experience resistance. We experience that very familiar pull, the homeostatic impulse, the desire that evolutionarily we all are kind of wrapped up
survival
to stay in those ruts. So practically, we could apply this small daily promise suggestion to the habit of creating conscious awareness, making the commitment not to be conscious throughout your entire day, 24 hours, because I'm going to let you in on something. You're not going to be able to. If you're so used to living from that autopilot, your brain is not used to firing from the very present, prefrontal cortex where consciousness lives, and all of the different brain waves. And like you've very beautifully shown in your book, The way the brain functions when we're in those toxic thought trees is compromised. It is different.
Yeah.
So setting an intention, perhaps build one moment of consciousness into your day using maybe this technology that I did say we have to be aware of how it affects us
To manage it. Yeah.
Setting maybe an alarm for some random time that you'll probably forget during your waking day. And when that alarm goes off on your phone, doing first a check-in with where your attention is. Where were you? Were you lost in thought, right? Were you rehashing the argument you had with your partner that morning? Were you rehearsing what you're going to tell your boss in the next hour at the next meeting to get out of that project? Or were you fully present to the moment at hand, to the now, the consciousness? And when chances are you were not as fully present as you could be, we want to begin to teach ourselves through that one small daily promise in that one moment how to become conscious. We can use our breath as our attentional anchor, focusing, beginning to flex our muscle of attention, because here's another area where we actually do have choice. Though most of us aren't used to making the choice. Our attention is grabbed in all of the which ways around us, as opposed to us consciously, deliberately saying, this is where I want to focus my attention. So we can use our breath, because chances are if we're alive, we're breathing in that moment, as our hook in that moment. And if we become aware of the action of breathing, the in-breath, the out-breath, now I'm in my body and I'm a bit more fully receptive to the present moment. So to build a foundational habit of consciousness, we want to begin to practice many more of those moments, though the pathway to many of those moments begins with one small daily promise. So set that alarm, do your consciousness check-in. If you're like most of us and your attention is nowhere to be found, begin that muscle training, begin to refocus the attention through the breath on the here and now, and give yourself the gift over time, as it will translate to choice in that moment, where you don't have to just react as you always did. You can begin to pepper in new choices to navigate life in that moment.
Oh, that's beautiful. I love that. Thank you so much. And I resonate with everything you said. It's just like, so I'm seeing all the science as you're talking. I'm seeing all the things, great things that are happening in one's brain when you do that. Just for those listeners that my community, this one daily promise is literally your active reach, step 5 of the neurocycle, where you've got to do something during the course of the day. Where I actually say to set an active reach reminder in my neurocycle app, where it's got to pop up and remind you to do that. And if you do that 7 times a day, there's a key shift. If you do it at least 7 times a day, that shifts the brain over into, it kind of is, it's enough. It's kind of like a magic number that starts pulling energy from this that we're trying to fix and giving it to this one that we're trying to grow as our reconceptualized version. So that daily promise is just absolutely beautiful. That showing up, that daily promise, it's phenomenal. I love it. I want to just quickly ask you one more question. Do you have time for one more question?
Absolutely.
I mean, I could ask you a million and we could talk all day, and I'm just quickly going to, but this is just such a beautiful one. You've spoken about this a lot. I'm just reading from the question that I wrote here. In the beginning of the book, you mentioned feeling stuck and how this makes the patient feel hopeless. And I know we've discussed this, but I want to talk about it a little bit more, and that they can actually change. I mean, the hopeless that they can't change, and that leads to shame and despair. And I know, as I said, I know we've touched on this, but I think this is important because it hinders so many people from change. I know you've touched on it, but I want us to talk a little bit more, because that's something that comes up so often when I do lives and in DMs, is people that feeling of the shame, the despair, and feeling hopeless. Those things kind of really go together. And when you hear this from someone like a DM or when you used to practice and a family member, what do you do? What would you say? And I know you've covered it, but let's get some practical stuff here and take it away. Explain a little bit. Give us some.
I appreciate you pulling back us to this, because I think that is for a lot of us that big initial hurdle, that feeling of hopelessness, that belief, right, that in our inherent damage or lack of worthiness for whatever it is that we want. And I think it does keep many of us stuck. So the first thing that I would offer, which I think can be healing in and of itself for some of us, and it's the large reason why I'm always talking about our body, our physiology, all of the different interacting factors in our physical, emotional, and spiritual selves that are contributing to the stuck, is because for some of us, that reframe is the relief we need. Hearing from someone else, right? And then settling into that belief within ourselves that actually we're not damaged. My body is responding as it was, wired to respond, or my emotions, are as they are based on experiences that I know I had, traumas that are stuck down to my cells in my body, and the way my nervous system is hyperactive or hypoactive, right, in any direction. So for some of us, that suggestion, that offering is the relief, is the healing, is the ability to say, oh, okay, I can now shift from this belief of brokenness. I have a reason. So like when we were speaking earlier, for some of us, the initial diagnosis is relieving. Oh, okay, there's a thing that this is, there's a reason I'm not broken. So that would be the first thing that I would offer. And I do offer all of the listeners here today, for those that just need to hear that and just need to sit with that. And because for a lot of us, that is where the relief from that shame comes. For the other majority of us, of course, it is the action. It is the action of empowering ourselves through the practice of making and keeping those small daily promises, through making new choices around our lifestyle, through changing the way our actual brains, to speak to your work, are structured, through creating that empowerment. So for a large majority of us, it is both of those steps. The latter, of course, is the process of making and keeping those promises, through the building of that basis of foundational consciousness, of course. Though I would offer both of those things, because relief can come when we can lose the label of I'm damaged or I can't, opening the door for some of us for the hope that then we can begin to march through these small daily actions.
Beautiful. I love that answer. And that is essentially, for those of you that know my work, that's essentially going to be at least a 63-day process. And very often I love how you say the first offering is to actually see yourself not as broken, but to actually see, you may have thought about that, but to have that statement, that other statement, no, you're not broken, no, you're not shame. So that's where it begins. And you may not believe it at first. In fact, you probably won't, because this is so established and so dominant. But have the hope that as you daily, with the work, as you say, doing the work of the daily, as you hit the different time points brain-wise, at 21 days, you'll start believing it. And by day 63, you'll start applying it in your life. And to know that there's actually time attached to that work kind of gives us hope. And at first, maybe people in our quick fix society, I want it to be done now. No, not going to happen. Do the work, as Nicole says. And at least you know that there's a time frame attached. At least you know within this amount of time, these are the changes that are happening in your brain. So I love it. Start with that. Your very first day one is like, you are not shame. You are not broken. Whatever that, to find that statement. And sometimes, as you said, someone else from the outside might have to give it to you. You may not be able to give it to yourself. And then from there, doing the work. Beautiful. I love that. That's incredible. Nicole, your work is just phenomenal. I mean, you talk about the relationship of spiritual, psychological. I'm just reading some of my other questions, that whole holistic approach. I can't agree with it more. I always talk about, as you know, the mind, brain, and the mind is the spiritual part of us, and the brain is this physical, and the brain is reliant on the spiritual. And you, with your book, just give us so much hope and insight into realizing we do have agency over that spiritual part of us, the mind part, and we can do the change, and there's going to be the effect, but it takes work. Thank you for what you do. It's incredible. Do you want to offer any last pearls of wisdom? This is not the end of the conversation. You've got to come back. We've got to continue our discussion. And I promise everyone who's listening, you will hear more from Nicole and from us together. Any last pearls of wisdom? And then also, where can people get the book, and where can they get hold of you? And we'll obviously put all the links in the show notes.
I want to offer, I think, to end on gratitude for each and every one of you out there listening, because I know even the challenge of hearing some of these new ideas that you and I speak so readily about is challenging. It does, for many of us, counter many of ingrained beliefs that we've been operating on, that we see reflected in our communities and even in society at large. So I really honor every human who shows up to hear myself, to hear you. I love the fact, honestly, that we both have new books out there, because I see them as just, kind of in tandem.
Hold up yours. Hold it up again.
Yeah,
there you go.
You really do give, very similar to you give the science, and I love being able to map on, like, here is brain change. Here is what it looks like through your book. So I just love that we both have this out there in the world. And
at the same time, within a week of each other, our books released. So guys, that's a message from the universe, guys. You need to get the two together, because it's totally enhancing.
I believe so. And like I said, I'm so grateful for people like yourself who have paved the way for, and empowered me to step into these truths, because there was a lot of disbelief in me. There was a lot of fear in me when I first began to share this from the holistic psychologist platform around my field. And what would people think? And am I going to be labeled the crazy person who's talking about the body? Am I going to be labeled the crazy person who's acknowledging the spirit, the essence? And overwhelmingly, the answer is no. So you've paved the way, and I am so appreciative. And like I said, everyone out there listening, know that the change that you're going to create in your life is going to go so far beyond your life. And also know that wherever you are in your healing journey right now is where you're meant to be. And appreciating yourselves as I am now for even listening, hitting play on this recording here, because I know some of this is challenging.
Yeah.
Let's go up against the way we've been living for so long. Though if either of us, you or I, Carolyn, can be that little glimmer of hope and can give someone the roadmap on how to begin to create change, then I believe at least I've done my work here.
Oh, that's beautiful. Thank you for saying that. And you just a phenomenal inspiration, how you've just grabbed these concepts and laid out there in the most humble and profound way. And you've opened a whole new world to people. So thank you for how you touch people's lives. And it's an honor knowing you. It's an honor calling you my friend. And I'm excited to do stuff together in the future to help more people get set free. You know, we enhance each other. There's one of my favorite quantum physicists who talks about the fact that it's not about you, it's about you and the world. And when you think about waves coming together in the sea, they either can cancel each other out, or they can grow and get bigger and enhance each other. That's how I see us working together to help the world. We want to enhance you. It's not competition. We just want to help you. We just want to enhance your life so that you have mental peace. So thank you for listening to Cleaning Up Your Mental Mess today. Thank you, Nicole, for being part of this and for sharing your journey and your story. We didn't even get to the details of your story, but you gave us so much insight and practical advice. But guys, get the book. And would you mind holding it up again, Nicole? Thank you so much. You've got to get this book. It's essential to understanding that doing the work, and it's okay. And wherever you're at, this is the journey, and it's going to be okay. Nicole, thank you so much for joining me today. And thank you everyone for joining Cleaning Up Your Mental Mess. See you next week.